Hey, Angela Wolf here. Welcome to Behind the Scenes. If you've never been here before, say hi, say where you're from. You never know, your neighbor might be sewing next to you or fishing. We are live on Facebook and YouTube, and I can see all your comments. So today I have a really fun show for you. It is going to be a binge watch of the Linda Tunic sew-along. So if you've been paying attention, we have sewn this for the last couple of weeks. You can go back and watch the videos on my Facebook and YouTube channel. But in the meantime, I chose a luxurious fabric, which is a little hard to see while I'm sewing. So I thought a good idea would be to let's take a look at the entire season of It's So Easy where I sewed the Linda Tunic sew-along. So grab a cup of tea and let's get started. Hi, I'm Angela Wolf, fashion designer and blogger, and this season we are doing a sew-along with this stylish tunic. There's a lot of variations. This top, very simple, tab sleeve. We're even going to go through another pattern hack and add some buttons. A lot going on here. We're even going to add lace later on. So let me show you what you need. First of all, pick out a nice tunic pattern. I'm using a pattern, this is called the Linda. It has a front piece, a back piece, a yoke. Very simple to do though, don't worry. We're gonna go through the collar, the placket, but what about fabric? I used a rayon challis for a lot of this. It feels almost like silk. It has a very light hand. It wrinkles a little bit, but that's part of the style, right? You could also use a silk charmeuse. That's my next top. And this fabric here is a polyester, but it's a sheer. Gives a whole different look. The big thing that you want though is make sure that the fabric has a nice drape. If it's too stiff, it's going to look like a box. The other thing you're going to need is some interfacing. This is fusible on one side. And what I would suggest is that when you prep your fabric, wash and dry it, just the way you're going to take care of your garments, so you can pre-shrink it. But the other thing is there's a lot of little pattern pieces. Let me just show you real quick. There's a collar that you're going to need to interface 2 pieces. The front placket is going to need 2 pieces. And this area here is all with interfacing. But when you try cutting out those itty-bitty pieces with interfacing, it can get a little sloppy. So I would suggest cutting a larger piece of fabric, interface this entire area, and then cut those smaller pieces. There are some other sewing supplies you're going to need. You'll catch on as we go. But one more thing, make sure you mark the back of your fabric. Much of this fabric looks exactly the same on both sides. So either grab stickers, or sometimes I use tailors chalk, make myself a little X. I'll know it's the wrong side. So gather your supplies, wash your fabric, and in the next episode, we're going to sew the front placket. Now you have the general idea of what fabrics to use, but think outside of the box. For example, this top is a burnout silk chiffon with velvet. This is going to be beautiful with a pair of leggings for New Year's Eve. And think of a knit. If you decide to sew with a knit, just go down one size because it doesn't need to be this loose because you just have to get it over your head, and if it has stretch, you don't need that extra fabric. Hi, Angela Wolf here, and we are starting our tunic top sew-along. So the pieces that you'll need is the front. This piece is cut of interfacing and your front placket. That's the first step. So on this pattern, you'll see that there's actually a marking. What that is for is interfacing. The fabric, when it's really light like this, I'm just going to flip this over. I like to put a piece of interfacing just to stabilize. Now I cut this a little bit wider so you could see it, but you want it to be basically 1/2 inch wider than where you're going to be sewing. The other thing I've already finished is top stitching. It's actually stay stitching, a very narrow stitch, 2.0, and I'll swing this back around here. What I did is this is the center of the top, and I'll make a chalk mark with white so you can see it. That's the center of the top. For those of you that might be using a different pattern, I went ahead and gave this chalk mark for you. Thinking ahead, 1 inch on either side of this would be probably a regular tunic pattern, okay? What I did is I added 1 more inch on each side and gave myself a mark here and then angled this line to here. This allowed the top to open just slightly. I kind of like that look. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut down the center just to give myself a guide. Now, you can mark it if you'd like, but I'm just going to eyeball this, and I'm cutting about 1/4 inch away from that stay stitching. And then do this side as well. And then cut across the bottom. And I'm grabbing a different pair of scissors for this. You need a very sharp point. I'm going to trim just to that corner. on both sides. Okay? The next thing I'm doing is I'm going to go and press. I'm using steam with the iron, and then I'm going to use a tailor's clapper to help hold this in place. So I'm folding it right along that stitch line. And press with a little bit of steam right to the corner where you clipped. Use the tailor's clapper to hold that in place, and then go all the way around and do the entire neckline. This is going to give you a guide of where to sew that placket. It helps to sew it in straight, and as you'll see, it solves a few problems. There we go. Again, I'm folding on my stay stitching line, which I stitched in a different color so you could see it, but you'd want to use the same color for yours. So this is what I have for my collar. We're ready to sew in the placket, and the last thing you'll need to do is take your pieces for your placket. Now here's a little tip. I cut mine about 2 inches longer than I need. It just makes it easier to insert, and you're not trying to match up your ends so much. You'll see, but I think you might find it to be easy. Just fold that in half, give it a good pressing, and I've already done this to both of my pieces, so I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew this in place. To get started, you really don't need pins for this. I'm using a straight stitch, about a 2.5 stitch length, and I prefer my needle to be in the center position. So let's take a look at the top so you know where I'm going here. I'm going to start on this side. I'm going to pull this out like this. Here is my placket. This is the raw edge. This is the finished edge. I pressed those together real good. And I'm just going to line this up. I have much more at the top and bottom than I need, but just take this, fold it, so to the wrong side, I can line this up, just like that. And I'm going to stitch right on the marks that I already have on here. If you notice, I'm going to start right at the corner of that point that we cut. Oops. Love it when the machine tells you to put your presser foot down. Back stitch a little bit. Again, you're right at that back corner, and stitch. And I'm stitching right along my pressed line this time, because just in case your stitch line wasn't straight, your pressed line will be. So that's one side. And now this other side here, I can just take, this is the raw edge to the raw edge. I'm going to flip this around so you can see that, so you're following. This is just the other side. Again, leaving plenty at the top, because I'm going to cut that off later. I'm lining up the raw edge to the raw edge on the placket. Let's stitch all the way down. If you've ever put in a welt pocket, this is the exact same technique. I'm stitching all the way down to the corner. And so far, this is what I have. Pretty nice. Now I would go and press this, but I'm just going to keep sewing so you can follow along. So this top was actually designed to be on an angle. Now if yours is straight up and down, I'm going to do that later on a different episode for buttons, but this is the part that you need to make sure stays straight. It's right here. I'm just going to pin this in place to give me a guide when I turn it upside down. So there we go. Flip your top. I'm trying to flip it slow so you could watch follow what's happening here. So that was the inside. These are my leftover plackets that I'm going to be cutting off. Let's go back to the machine. Now I know there's a pin in there, so be very careful. The first thing I'm going to do is just line up the edge of my foot. It's not going to hit that pin, so no worries there. I'm going to put my needle in the left position, and all I'm doing is stitching on the edge here, away from that pin, just keeping those plackets in place. So this I can just cut, get rid of that extra. Now, what about that pin? The next thing I want to do is I'm holding my hand to the back and removing that pin. Because I did that little stay stitching, it kept everything in place. So here is the trick. When you stitch this one, put it back to the center position here. You're starting in the corner, but instead of stitching straight across, you're going to angle in and back out. And that is the part that makes your placket look more professional. In and then back out, ending right at that corner. And I'll bring you back up here and show you what this looks like. I think it'll be easier to see. So you can kind of see how that's curved, but really from the right side of the garment, you can't tell that. It's only a little tip to help keep your placket nice and flat. So I'm going to just give this a little pressing. Depending on your fabric, you might want to use a press cloth so you don't end up with iron marks. The next thing I would do is go around and top stitch this, but let me show you it from the back and then I'll pull out one that's finished. So this is the back side. You're going to trim off that extra. Again, it's kind of a little bit hard to see with the white on white, but it curves just a little bit. So let me grab this one. I've already finished this piece, just so you can see, because you have one more step here. I went through here and I top stitched all the way around, just right on the edge. It keeps it in place. Right before I did that, I went through and serged all the edges. So this is what the wrong side looks like, just like this. And the last step is to fold these together to make sure that they match. And we're going to cut a curve, which you'll see on the neckline, and you'll use your pattern as a guide. But basically, this is going to go just like this. And do that to both pieces. A little curve like this, and you're all set. So in the next episode, we're going to gather the shoulders and sew in our collar. So you can see the placket isn't that difficult to sew, but keep in mind, it's supposed to angle open before we put that collar on, not closed. If you try to close this, you'll never get it around your neck. So do you have any questions for me? If not, we'll just keep rolling. Hi, I'm Angela Wolf, fashion designer and online instructor, and we are continuing sewing our Linda tunic. Today, we're going to sew the gathers and attach the collar. So the pattern pieces that you're going to need are the front and the back, which you've already attached the placket, so there's your front, 2 yoke pieces, and 2 collar pieces. For the gathering, if you notice, I have little snips here in the top of my shirt. So I'm going to put chalk here just so you can see. This is where the gathering, this will be gathered to the yoke. And then on the back piece, I did the same thing. I'll put some big chalk pieces. This is going to be gathered to the yoke. So the gathering on all 3 of these areas is exactly the same. I'm just going to show you the back, and then we're going to sew the collar on. So let's go to the sewing machine. So for the back piece, I find this to be very easy to do it all in one step. So you don't need to keep going back and forth and pinning. I'm going to take the machine and change it to a basting stitch, which is a 5.0, and start just before that notch that you have. And this is the right side of the fabric facing up, okay? And then just go forward a little bit. Oops, wrong button. Go forward and back stitch. And then make sure it's on the basting. Okay, great. Just go straight. Go a little past your chalk mark here. And instead of using your thread cutter, if you have that, you're going to put the needle in the up position and just pull this out. You need this long thread tail here. Now don't leave the machine. This is very simple. So take your bobbin thread, your bobbin, and just pull gently. Just like that. How much do you pull? Well, you'll see in just a minute. So I'm going to try to sew this and lift it up so you can see, because it's going to be covered, if that makes any sense. This is my back yoke piece. So with right sides together, this is my wrong side facing up. I'm going to start right here from the edge, change my stitch back to a regular stitch length. Center position is what I prefer, and this pattern has a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm just going to stitch, back stitch, and now I'm just going to hold my fabric right before that gathering starts and just stitch. I can feel that gathering with my fingers, so I'm stopping with the needle in the down position. The next thing I want to do is take my fabric and start here at the back side, so I know that that matches. And I'm just going to grab one pin to hold this in place. This rayon challis is a little slippery, and if you're using silk chiffon or charmeuse, that's really slippery. So this will help you a little bit. And then I'm going to line up a little bit more here and put one more pin. Okay. So here you go. This is my basting. You can see that, my gathering. And if you might notice, that's only about 1/8 or 2, like 1/4 of an inch barely in there. So this is going to be covered up. So here we go. Go ahead and stitch, and I'm going to make sure that those gathers are all in place, if you can see that. And then take the pins out and go ahead and stitch to the end. So my basting stitches are going to be covered up. I might have gotten that off just about 1/4 of an inch, but that's what happens when you do it live, right? Okay, so let's see what we have. And there's my gathering. I will cut those threads, obviously. Those are my basting, but that's how easy that is. And then I will gather the front 2 pieces here and here. So let's get moving on to the collar. The collar is pretty simple. I actually cut my collar just a little bit longer than the pattern. Again, I like to have a little bit extra. It's just a personal preference. So, with the right side of the garment facing up and your collar facing down, you have to picture it's going to look like this. I'm going to start just on the edge here. And the collar is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to stitch, and then we're going to go around. I think I'm just going to pull this out on the machine. It makes it a little bit easier to maneuver. There we go. Now the collar can fit right around the edge. And I'm just going to stitch this collar right to the right side of the garment. And if you just hold this in place, you can get around the curve quite easily. One thing I might have forgotten to mention is that I've already sewn both of my yokes in place. So there was 2 yokes. The inside one covers up the raw edges. You don't have to use that if you're using a sheer fabric, but I'll get more into that on a later lesson. All right, and let's get to the end and back stitch. So the outside of the collar is in place. Make sure there's no puckering. That looks fine. And I'm going to just show you how to take this in place. You don't need any pins. I'm just going to start at the end using 1 pin to hold it. Let's see here. I'm going to do this part slowly. It's like this. Take this piece and fold it inside. So what you have here is I'm sandwiching this inside of this collar, just at the end. So I'll put a pin there, so I'd need more hands to show you. Okay, so that's folded inside. So I'm stitching on the exact same stitch line that I just had, just on the bottom edge and then around. So I'm just gonna do half of the collar so you can see what this looks like. So again, this is stitching in the exact same place that I just stitched, except both of my collars are right side together. And I can feel, I'll use this pin so you can see where this pin is. That's the edge of my collar. And when I get there, I'm just going to put the needle in the down position. Fold this around. And there's my top collar. And I'm just going to go a little ways and then stop so you can see what actually happened there. It's a little hard to sew and twist and show you at the same time. A little bit further. Okay, I'm going to stop right there before I get to the other end. I just want to show you what was here. See, this is the wrong side. I'm just going to snip that corner. And pull this. So you can see how that finished the front edge. I'll still have to finish the back, but it attached it right to that placket. It makes the front edge look so nice. So I'm just going to go finish all the way around this side, and then we need to go press. Again, I'm going to stop about right there. Oops, I didn't mean to cut. I keep hitting the wrong button. I'm going to slide this into the inside and stitch. I'm trying to keep my hands out of the way here. Okay. Again, I told you I cut my collars a little bit longer just because I like to have the extra. You don't have to do that. If you don't, you just pin and you make sure it lines up. So this is what I have so far. This would be if I didn't attach that bottom part. So now turn this to the right side out and tuck under your placket. So again, this is the edge of my collar. That was my previous seam here. I'm going to line those two up and just stitch a little ways. It just makes the end of your collar look nice and finished. And I'll just go a little ways. And now we're going to go press. So up here, make sure I cut enough of that out. You'll want to go through and trim the edges so they're about 1/4 of an inch or less. Stick my finger in there. Before I flip over my collar, I'm using a point press to press the collar seams open. This just makes it, if you have your collar, you don't want the seam to stick to the outside. Give a little steam. And I'm just going to do a little bit of this, but I think you get the idea. You're going to do it for the entire collar though. Okay, and now lay your collar flat. I'm pressing the collar into itself, the seam allowance into the collar, away from the garment. All right, and the last thing is to take your collar now, and because I press that seam open, notice how it can curl to the back here. It's curling towards the inside of the garment. If you have any problems with that, you can understitch it, and that will help. And then just tuck your seam allowance under, press, and use a tailor's clapper. There you go. And give a little more pressing. Now, I'm not going to do the whole collar, but you're going to do it for the entire collar. That's the inside, this is the outside. Your last step is going to be to top stitch. I'm just going to top stitch just a little bit for you from the right side of the garment. So going back to the sewing machine, make sure that your stitch is about a 2.5 for this. It could go up to a 3.0, but 2.5 for a shirt is pretty good. And I'm going to do a stay stitch, and then go ahead and stitch. And I'm stitching right next to this collar, and I can feel my seam allowance underneath. All right, I'll go a little bit further. Obviously you would do this for the whole collar, and I'm just doing a half. But you're gonna go all the way around. And this is what the outside of your collar will look like. This is what the inside looks like. I'm using contrasting threads so you can see it. So let's go back up here and take one more look. When you're finished, so we gathered the front to the back. We gathered the front to the back yoke. I sewed those together. There's my gathering here. And this is the part I wanted to show you where the inside, this was the second yoke that covered up all those seams. Then you attach your collar and your entire front is finished. So the last step before we move on to the sleeve, you're going to sew the sleeve in place, or you're going to sew your tabs in, which is what we're going to do in the next lesson. So the gathering isn't that difficult, but what if you don't want all that extra fabric? Maybe you're using a fabric that's a little thicker and you don't want those gathers right here. You can remove them by altering your pattern. This dart right here can be moved to the side or down below. So get creative. So if you have any questions, leave them below. I'm following along with you. If you're just joining us and you missed the beginning and you want to rewatch this, be sure to follow my Facebook page or subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you'll be able to go back and watch this from the beginning. This is the entire season 17 of It's So Easy, Sewing the Linda Tunic Sew Along. So let's keep rolling. Hi, I'm Angela, a fashion designer and vlogger, and today we're sewing the tab on a sleeve. This is a very fashionable and popular item to have that you could even add to a top that you already own. So let me show you how this works. First of all, on your sleeve pattern, I have a marking right here that shows you where that tab goes. So you can measure from the hem up if you don't have that, but I've given myself the same chalk markings. Here's my sleeve head, and this is exactly where the tab placement's going to be. So I'm going to put that to the side for right now. Let's make the tab. So this is about 17 inches long, 3 inches wide, if you want to just make your own. I fold over the end and press it in place. Next thing I'm going to do with wrong sides together is stitch from one end to the other, which I've done here with purple thread so you can see my chalk marks for the wrong side. And then if you have a tool to turn this right side out, or if you have a safety pin, that always works too. I stick this in here and I'm going to start pulling. You're just turning it to the right side out. But one thing I want to point out, do you notice that once this edge was tucked under, I stitched right over that on both sides? It just makes it easier for that end to be nice and crisp as a point. So just pull this. Little trick is if you get your fingers wet on slippery fabric, it works a little bit easier. There you go. And the end that I had pressed under is right here. So you're going to press that in place. The entire piece. What I try to do is keep that seam edge on one side. Now it's going to peek out to the front or the back, so I'm going to try to face it towards what I would call the wrong side of my tab. So I'm just give a little pressing. You can see how that tucks it right in. The next thing I'll do is go around and top stitch along the entire piece, which I've already done here. And I used the same color thread, so I'm not sure if you can see that, but I stitched all the way around, starting at one end to the other, and serged the edge. One more thing I want to point out, depending on what fabric you're using, if it frays a lot, then you might want to put a little bit of interfacing before you did all of this right at the end, but I didn't for this fabric. So the next thing I'm going to do is put a buttonhole in the end. I'm just going to give myself a guide right here, a buttonhole, and we're going to attach the button. This is what the sleeve looks like. The tab is sewn to the wrong side of the garment. The button is sewn to the right. That's all we have to do for this tab. So come on over to the sewing machine. First thing I'm going to do is sew a buttonhole. So take your buttonhole foot, depending on what your machine, everyone looks a little different. This front part, or yours might be in the back, is where the button goes. And that tells your machine how long of a buttonhole to make. I'm going to remove the standard foot and then just slide this in place. Go ahead and choose any buttonhole's fine. I'm picking a little bit of a decorative one. Slide this into place. All right, I'll get my hand out of the way so you can see. So the fabric is between the two metal layers, and just start your buttonhole. Now I have the foot pedal pressed all the way down. You love it when the machine knows how fast and how slow to go to make a perfect buttonhole. Now while that's stitching, I'm going to find the wrong side of my sleeve, and this is where I'm going to sew that tab. All right, let's just pull this whole foot out so you can see this fabric was right between the two metal layers. That gave you a little better view. And here we go. So this is going to be the wrong side of your tab to the wrong side of the fabric. I'm just going to slide this up, throw on my J-foot, change it to a straight stitch, and just stitch back and forth a couple times. By the way, if you have one of those fun machines that stitches in different directions, you could make a really cute box on this. Okay, so that's the wrong side. Now go to the right side, and we're going to attach our buttonhole. This is why I said if you don't sew your sleeve shut yet, it's so much faster this way. So this is my buttonhole foot, and there's a couple things I want to point out. This metal part goes up and down, and you can slide your button in here. Now, if you're using a thick button, that won't work so well, but this one's fine. It could have 2 holes or 4. And there's also a little plastic part back here that if you slide back or forward, gives you a shank, which would make your button ride higher. You don't need the shank engaged, so push that to the back, and then just slide this into place. There we go. All right, go to your screen and choose, there's actually a button sewing stitch, if you can believe that. It's at the bottom, on my machine, at the bottom of all the buttonholes. It tells me what foot to use. So now, again, we have our tab on here. I used white thread so you can see this. Get some of those threads out of the way. Slide this here. Now this is very important. You do not want to just start sewing because you don't know for sure if your buttonholes are in the right place where your needle's going to go. So I'm just going to go just with my hand at first. It looks like it's fine, so go ahead and stitch. And this will actually lock the stitch, stitch the button in place, and lock it again. So click up. All right, slide this out. Okay, so here's my button. This is, again, now this is on the right side of the fabric. Before I go up there to cut this, I just want to show you. And then again, on the back side is your tab. So let's go back up here to the top, and I want to show you what's going to happen here. This is going to end up folding up, and this is going to attach. This is why you can see this is the wrong side of the tab. This is what I was explaining to you earlier, that you can kind of see that, and it'll be hidden here. So for your buttonhole, I know that it's tempting to grab a pair of scissors or a seam ripper to cut this, but if you have a tool that will cut buttonholes, just slide this in place and cut. If your fabric frays a lot, you might want to put just a dab of that on here, or a liquid that stops fraying. But cut your buttonhole. There we go. Make sure you use a piece of wood on that so you don't ruin your tables. And then this button's in place. You're going to do this to both sleeves. That's how it'll end up looking. Pretty cool. All right, so your next step is going to be, once you have both of your sleeves done with your tabs, make sure you have your your back and your front marked on your sleeve. You're going to sew your sleeve into the entire armhole, and then you're going to stitch your entire side seam and armhole closed. And that's the sleeve tab. But for those of you that like to add embroidery or decorative stitching, that's a great place to do that. Or change up the sleeve altogether and use a different fabric. In the next lesson, I'm going to give you a little pattern hack for a different sleeve for the Linda tunic. Hi, Angela Wolf, fashion designer and online instructor, and we are still sewing our tunic, but today is a pattern hack on the sleeve. There's so many options you could do with one simple top. So maybe you don't want the button anymore. How about a couple other options? Adding a placket at the bottom. This is 2 pieces of fabric because I wanted the trim on the lace. You don't have to use lace though, it could be any fabric. And I added a piece of elastic in there. I'm going to show you how to do that. But I also threw this one out. I know it's a knit, but this sleeve could even be bigger with a bell sleeve. So let me show you how to alter this sleeve. So first of all, here's my sleeve pattern. This is where it would normally hem, where you can see that black mark there. And I'm just going to give you a little help here. I could either line up my grain line with the ruler and draw straight down. That's one option because the sleeve is already pretty wide. So that's one option for the hem. It still looks nice, it still looks great. Otherwise, if you want to go with a bell, you can angle it out a little bit more. Or, my paper doesn't go that far, you can angle out as far as you want to. That's if it's connected to this. So one thing is what I usually do is I will measure how much longer I want the sleeve. So with the black one behind me, this is kind of scrunched up a little bit, a piece of elastic in here, and then I have my beautiful lace cuff. Okay, so all I did was I angled it out just a little bit. And once you have it marked on one side, I would just fold the paper in half so it's even on the other. I could either cut it all as one piece of fabric or use this as a seam line and add seam allowances to each one, and you have 2 pieces of fabric. Okay, pretty easy, but if you go to It's So Easy TV, you can download the directions if you need some more on that. So here is a sleeve. One piece, I just extended the length, just straight. This is bias tape. You want the bias to be just enough that you can fit the elastic through it. Now, you would probably think, wait a minute, wouldn't you sew the side seams first? No, not for this one. This makes it really easy, especially if you're using a sheer fabric. I'm going to cut that a little bit smaller. So let's go to the sewing machine, and I'm just going to show you what you do here. So I'm leaving plenty of room here for the seam allowance. I'm just using a straight stitch, and stitch along the edge. Stitch length about 3.0 is fine. Stitch to the edge. I don't know if I backstitch at the beginning, but make sure that you backstitch because you don't want this to come off later. I'm just going to trim this a little shorter so it's not in the seam allowance. Backstitch. And do the same thing down the other side. There are so many ways you can insert elastic into a seam, into a cuff. But what I find is when it's a cuff area where it's real narrow, it's difficult to do just a zigzag stitch and make sure that the elastic is even. So this is just another option. All right, so if this was 2 pieces of fabric, I would have sewn both of my pieces together and this would be covering up that seam or attach the seam, whatever you want. The next thing you do is just sew down the seam. This is about a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this pattern, but you would sew whatever you're... So the next thing you would do is press your seam allowance opener to one side, but notice how there's an opening here and an opening here. So I've already attached my elastic. This is a tool that if this was laying flat, this would pull the elastic right through really fast. But since I've already sewed this in the round, I'm just going to use a safety pin. And you just wiggle this through, making sure that the elastic doesn't twist. And again, this is a great way to cover that seam up, especially if you're using sheer fabric. All right. Getting through to the other side. It's kind of gathering a little bit. That's what I want it to do. There we go. Let's pull this out a little bit. Okay. There we go. We got both sides. So what you're going to do is you're going to pull the elastic as tight as it needs to fit on your wrist. How tight is that? All I usually do is I'll stick my hand in the sleeve myself. You don't need a fitting partner for this section. And just pull it as tight as you think would be comfortable. Remember, you want it to go on your wrist tightly so then the cuff will hang down a little bit and this top of the sleeve will kind of bell over it. So make it a little tight, and then what I like to do is I'll pin it in place. I'll do a basting stitch, try it on again, because you just never know. And also, when you're using a thin elastic like this, sometimes you need it tighter than you think because the elastic doesn't hold as well as a thicker elastic. So back to the sewing machine, I'm just going to pull this out a little ways. You can use a zigzag stitch or a straight stitch, it doesn't matter. I have the elastic folded over each other. I'm just going to go back and forth a couple times. Looks pretty secure. Let's open this up. And there is my cuff. So from the right side, flip this around. It's tight. I can gather the fabric wherever I need it to be. Now, this is a really thick fabric. Going back over here to this one, I actually embroidered this on chiffon. You could use any fabric, but it's still the same look where the cuff hangs down, this hangs close to your wrist, and you've altered your sleeve. So that's a great pattern hack. Continue to follow along on It's So Easy while we sew this tunic.
I have to say, this is absolutely one of my favorite Linda tunics. I love the embroidery, the sheer sleeves, and I love the pattern hack on the end. So look in your machine. You might have embroidery designs that will work for this. This is from my Lace Collection 1, which you can find at angelawolfpatterns.com, and I'll leave a discount code below for you. All right, let's keep going.
Hi, Angela Wolf here, fashion designer and vlogger, and what sew-along would not be complete without a few pattern hacks. So in this one, I want to show you how to change this neckline to add buttons and a buttonhole. Now this neckline, I kept the exact same dimensions where it kind of opens a little bit, but let me show you how to make a closed one. So this is what we're going for. This opens and closes. So again, it's a placket, but you have the buttons and the buttonhole. It can be closed, and then you'd add all your collar like we did earlier. So the big difference, if you compare your pattern,
is that instead of that angle, like I was doing, you would just have a line straight up. And this is 1 inch, okay? So that's the fold of the fabric. So here I have, just like in the previous episode with the placket interfacing, I chose different colors so you can see my top stitching. Well, it's not top stitching, stay stitching. So then when I trim this, just like we did before, and then cut into each corner, go back over here and press this. So the big difference here is how you attach the placket at the bottom, how you measure your buttons and buttonhole. Otherwise, it's pretty close to what we did earlier. Give a little steam. All right. And I'm folding right along that stay stitching line. Again, this allows your stitching when you add your placket to be pretty straight. I'm never sure if it's perfectly straight, but it's pretty straight. And then just fold back that little bottom edge here. All right. Okay, so I have this ready to go. I also have my 2 plackets here folded in half, same as before. 2 of these that are cut just a little bit longer. Let's go to the machine. There's the raw edges. They match up to the raw edges here. I'm going to flip this around, line up those like this, and do a straight stitch. I'm just going to stitch right along the stay stitching line or the fold, whichever one is straighter, and go right to the edge of this triangle right here. Not through it, just to the edge. Just a back stitch. Okay, that's one side. And now grab, sorry, get this. There you go. Now we're going to grab the other side. Again, doing the same thing that we did previously. Flip it to the wrong side. There's our raw edges. Again, I'm leaving plenty of room at each end because I'll trim that off. As I mentioned earlier, you don't have to do that. It just makes it easier, I think. Back stitch and stitch to the end. Now this is where the difference is from the last placket that we do. I'm going to go up here and mark my buttonhole and my buttons. Okay, and then to the right side. See how that lines up pretty good. So before you do your top stitching and you sew that bottom section like we did previously, this is where we're going to mark our buttonholes. So this is how I always think of this with a top. It buttons like this for a woman. So this is the bottom where the buttons are going to go, and this is where the buttonholes are going to go. So I have this little contraption that will allow me, I know I want 3 buttons. So I'm just going to, what I'm going to do is mark where I want to make sure, what I'm doing is I'm marking where all 3 of these are, but I want to stay clear of this collar area. So I'm just going to make that a little bit. 1, 2, 3. Now keep this in the same position and lay it to the side, because when we're finished sewing these button holes, we're going to sew all this together, and then the last step will be sewing the buttons underneath. All right, now because this isn't sewn at the bottom, I've got this huge area to allow me to sew a buttonhole. I think that's much easier than having it all sewn together. So I'm lining up this chalk mark right here with this red line. If you can see that in the foot. So let me slide this over, and then I'll move my hand out of the way. That's pretty close. Making sure that I'm lining the edge of my foot up with the edge of that stitching. Choose a buttonhole again, it doesn't matter what you pick. Now another idea on this placket, if you really want to get creative, you could make this longer, as long as you want to, if you have buttons on it. So it'd be the same process, you just would have to draw the lines longer and make longer plackets to put in here. This is a common collar on golf shirts, things like that. All right, one is done, finished. Let's move on to the next. I'm just sliding down, there's my chalk mark. The most important part is to make sure that that pressed edge is straight. Otherwise your buttonholes will all be crooked. Now I'm using, don't fret if it's not just right. All right. And one more. I'm sure you don't need to watch me sew 3 buttonholes, but there's a reason for this, because then when I line all this up with the buttons, you'll understand how I'm doing that. Actually, buttonholes are so much easier to sew nowadays. The machines and the special feet make it very easy. One thing I might not have mentioned is inside these plackets, there is interfacing here, and that is what will prevent your buttonholes from fraying. I don't know if you saw that earlier. This one I'm using black fusible knit. On the previous episode, I did white. So, all right, so our buttonholes are finished. Let's go back up here. Slide this. All right, it's looking pretty good. So the next step I want to do, because if I don't sew this bottom edge before I put the buttons on, it could end up a little bit crooked. So what I want to do is make sure this is nice and even. This lines up really nice. I'm just going to grab a pin. I usually have pins stuck in my shirt, but not today. I'm just going to pin that. So I've pinned through both of these layers. So I know that's where I'm going to stitch at the bottom. Now let's mark our buttonholes. Oops, you know what? I did that backwards. Here you go. Buttonhole goes on the top. There we go. That looks right. There. Now notice when I pull this, see how it can change? You want that to be a perpendicular area down here. That looks pretty straight. So I've pinned through both plackets and this layer here. See? I'm going to go back and mark my buttons. If you locate the center of your buttonholes, now it looks like one of mine might be a little bit off, but I'm just going to leave it for now. Mark where you want. This is just a fabric marking pen that will disappear in 24 hours. I'm just going to give myself 3 circles for my buttons. So the next steps are going to be to sew this bottom area like I did earlier. We're going to top stitch around here and attach our buttons. Hold this in place, flip it to the back side, and that's where I'm going to be stitching, right across here. Now if you remember previously, I told you to stitch kind of on a curve right through here, and that's what we're going to do again. And I'm using white thread so you can see this, and then I'll stop so you can fabric of the garment side up so you don't actually cut something that you don't want to cut. And I'm just going to attach one of the buttons here to show you how to do that again, and then we're pretty much finished. So here's my buttonhole foot. I'm going to just slide my button in place. Again, keeping my shank to the back if you have that on yours. Slide that into place. All right, go to your button foot. Your button stitch, which actually lowers your feed dogs and slides your button in place. I'm putting my button on where the stitching goes this way, and that will match how the buttonhole is. Do it by hand first to make sure your needle goes through the right holes. Stitch. Now you're going to attach all 3 buttons. I don't think you need to see me do those. When you're doing your top stitching, you need to be careful that you don't accidentally sew these two together. So I'm pushing it out of the way to start. Stitch all the way down. And then I stop. And I'm going to just lift this up, slide the bottom of the placket underneath. Now, this is when you would button them in place, by the way, if you had them. Go this down. Now you're stitching through both plackets and the garment. And then back up this side. Now I'm going to slide this out of the way again, just because it's easier to see. So I'm stitching just a scant away from this edge here, like 1/8 of an inch. If your buttons get in the way, you can always stop and move your needle to a different position. So let's go up here and see what we have. This is looking really good. So that's nice top stitching around. You'd have all of your buttons. And the last thing you'll need to do is cut these open. I showed you on a previous episode how to do this, but you can add a dab of freight check and you just push this in place. This is much safer than a seam ripper or scissors because if you go too far, you're gonna have to sew this whole part over. So there we go. And since I only have one button on there, I'll just cut one of these for you. And this is a variation where you can have a button collar for this tunic. Very easy to do. In the next episode, I'm going to show you how to hem the garment.
You know me, one pattern, many ways. I love to have different variations. So adding buttons or rivets or something like that fun to the neckline would be really cute. Easy to do. So what do you think so far? Are you going to add lace or some buttons to your Linda tunic? Be sure to let me know your questions. I'm watching with you.
Hi, Angela Wolf here. So the last step at sewing our Linda tunic is to hem. And hemming on the curves sometimes gets people in trouble. So I'm going to show you how to do a really small hem. So this is what the pattern looks like as a refresher. And here I've just taken one piece. I don't think you need to watch the whole top. But basically I'm going to turn this under, stitch all the way around, flip it up, press it, and do it again. So follow along. So I have a 2.5 stitch length. You could even go up to a 3.0 if you want. And I'm stitching just along the edge. Now watch what happens when I go around the curve, and I'll try to keep my hands out of the way. But I'm sticking my finger in here and pulling the fabric this way. So as I'm stitching around the curve, I'm just getting the little edge of that curve. Now, if my cutting is crooked or anything else, it doesn't really matter because we're going to be folding that later, or you can trim it off. The most important is that the stitch looks nice and smooth on the sewing machine. So go a little bit further. And like I said, I'm just taking a little piece here going around the curve so you can see what this is like. Now we're going into the upper part of the curve, and again, I'm holding my finger there just to measure so I can keep that stitch about equal. Now I'm using a contrasting thread again so you can see this, but let's go up to the pressing area. So the first thing, there's a lot of wrinkles there. Not to worry. Give it a little pressing with some steam, and it's gone. A little bit further, and it's gone. And I can see that right through this area here, I have a little bit more seam allowance than I do other places. So you could actually trim that if you want to and make it even. I'm just going to keep going for now. And around. So look at all those wrinkles disappeared.
Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this up and press a little bit further. So I'm basically enclosing that hem allowance. You can still see your previous stitch right here, barely. But I find this to be the easiest way to do this rolled hem. So how much am I turning it up each time? Well, this pattern has a 1/2 inch hem, so 1/4 inch plus 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to be pressing again. Pressing is probably your best friend besides trying to sew straight when you're doing this hem. So let's go back to the machine. Now, from the right side of the fabric, I've tucked this under, and I'm going to stitch just on the edge. So where I'm stitching is just on the edge, capturing that folded hem. So your first stitch line, are you going to see it from the right side of the fabric? Nope. But it sure helps make a good guideline to fold this up and press. I usually try to top stitch from the right side of the garment. Not always, but usually. And I can feel that fold underneath. And then keep going around. And what I'm doing is I'm lining the edge of the fabric up with this edge of the foot so I can see that myself. There are other specialty feet that you can use for a hem, but this is what I find to be the easiest. If you're in a real big hurry, you could skip that last pressing step and just turn it under and press at the end. I just find this to be a little bit more foolproof. And again, you can see it's kind of wrinkling just a little bit, but give it a little pressing. If you're using a silk or a fabric that can show your iron, be sure to use a press cloth or press from the wrong side of the hem. See how that goes around? So this will allow your shirt to be longer in the front, longer in the back, but shorter on the sides. Very stylish. Looks great with leggings. You could add a belt. Here you go. There's the curve. It looks great. And one more thing with this hem, by the way, I wanted to show you that other stitch under there, you can see that, but not from the right side. So one more thing is this pattern is very versatile. You could cut across this pattern. I would cut about right at the hip length and lengthen it as long as you want. You could have a dress. This would look great on the beach over a bikini too. So that's how you hem. Now, again, I have one more pattern hack for you. We're going to change the sleeves to lace. So a rolled hem is pretty easy to do on a rayon fabric or a lightweight fabric. But if you're using a knit, you probably want to use a cover stitch. And something like this, I might even use the lettuce edge on the serger. All right, before we go, I want to show you one more pattern hack. Let's change up the sleeve one more time. Hi, Angela Wolf here with the last of our Linda Tunic sew along with a pattern hack, of course. So maybe you don't want the sleeve with the button. How about switching it up to some lace and adding a knit cuff? Very easy to do. So first of all, let's talk about the different styles of lace. Some of the lace that you find might have a beautiful hem edge. That's perfect. You can just take your sleeve pattern, which I have here, and you're going to want to add maybe 1 or 2 inches because the lace usually hangs a little bit lower. So measure from your shoulder to your wrist, or however long you want the edge of that lace, because remember, you're not going to be hemming that. And all you'd have to do is add that length to the bottom of this pattern and cut that out of lace using this as the hem. Here's another example of a beautiful finish on the end. So 2 ideas, but very common, you might find some lace that does not have that finished edge. For example, this. I bought this for St. Patrick's Day and I haven't made it into anything yet, but there's no finished edge. Okay, same with this one here. This is more bridal. So let me show you what you can do for that. Here I have leopard lace. This is my salvage. I left this on here so you could see how the edge is finished. So I'm going to either have to turn this up or find something. And lace turned up doesn't look so good. So here is my fabric. I've cut out my pattern. And here's a cuff. So this is just a sport knit. Over here, I'm using a rayon knit on the dress form back there. So basically, this just fits to your sleeve, to your arm, to your wrist, and sew it to the sleeve. So cut out your pattern exactly the same as you would. I actually added 1 inch to this because I wanted mine to hang over the cuff. To design your cuff, take your fabric,
You can make this any width that you want. So remember, it's folded in half. So take a piece of fabric, fold it in half, and lay it around your wrist, just like this. If you want it to be shorter, it could be longer, whatever you want, but there you go. Don't forget you're going to need a seam allowance. So this is high-tech pattern making, right? I think that looks pretty good. So the next step you're going to do is take this, your sleeve, with right sides together, fold it in half. You're going to stitch from one end to the other. When you're stitching lace, just be careful not to stretch it while you sew. I've already done that here with a serger, which is, you could do that or a French seam if you want to enclose it. And I've pressed this. The next step you're going to do is take your cuff with right sides together. So remember, it'll be like this on my arm, and stitch all the way down the edge, just like this here. So let's go to the serger. All right, now depending on what kind of fabric you have, you might want to use a 3-thread or a 4-thread overlock. I prefer, it really doesn't matter, 4 thread's just a little sturdier for your cuff. And just go ahead and stitch. I'm trimming a little bit since my cutting was a little bit crooked. And there you go. Notice how this stretches with the fabric. That makes it really nice, especially for your cuff to get around your hand, to get onto your wrist. So I'm folding this in half. Wrong sides together. And this is going to be my cuff. Lining up those seams, and I'm just going to leave this to the side for now. I'll just put it on my arm so I don't lose it. There you go. So now, what do we do with the sleeve? I told you I've already sewn this seam, pressed it to the back side, just like we did in a previous episode. But if you look here, this has a lot more fabric than the cuff does. And it's really tricky to stretch this enough evenly, so what I like to do is baste it. So go ahead and use a straight stitch, change it to a stitch length of 5.0. And I'm going to slide this in place. Go ahead and do a back stitch, and then stitch all the way around. See how I can push that fabric out of the way? That's just a little trick if you're ever trying to get inside of a really narrow hem too. Very easy to do. All right, again, don't use your thread cutters because you need this long tail here. And take your bobbin thread. Now, I used a contrasting thread, which is white, but you can just barely see it on that lace. Maybe I should have used yellow, but hopefully you can see that. Give it a little pull, and it will evenly gather around your sleeve. If you didn't do a back stitch at the beginning, the whole thing will pull out and you have to do it over, so trust me, I've been there. All right, so there is my gathering. You see that okay? So now, turn the sleeve right side out. I like to always double check how everything is fitting. So if I were to slide this on my arm, the cuff is going to go right here at the end. Take this, turn it under, and pull this off. Now you know that you're sewing it to the right way. Inside out, wrong side out. Here we go. Okay. Here's my seam, and here's the seam on my cuff. Now I am going to use a few pins here because I just need to keep this straight. I'm going to slide this fabric out just a little bit so I can see it as I'm pinning this in place. Again, gather as you go around. You can also stretch your knit just a little bit if it didn't gather enough or you're worried about it being even, but the gathering just helps you kind of make it where it's going to be even all the way around. So, all right, there we go. So now I'm just going to use another basting stitch because those are easy to rip out. You cannot use a straight stitch on this because it will pull. If you don't have a serger, we're going to do the basting stitch first, and then you're going to use a zigzag stitch, and that will be your final stitch. So again, I'm using a basting. Let's go ahead and attach these. Why do I baste it first? Well, because if for some reason it gathered wrong or the fabric folds, have you ever tried ripping out a serging stitch? It's a lot of fun, trust me. So this actually, if something gets screwed up or it doesn't look right, it's easy to rip out. All right, go a little bit further. And again, I'm stitching, this is the wrong side of the fabric. All right, I think we got it all the way around. So first, roll this over and make sure, see how it looks. Get rid of this. Now, by the way, this is a contrasting color so you can see it as well. I'm not sure I'd put those two together. So let's go to the serger real quick and give it one last little serge. It looks great. Again, if you don't have a serger, go do a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch or something where the fabric can stretch to go over your hand. Try to keep my hands out of the way here so you can see. And I'm just trimming down the extra fabric, going all the way around. Chain off, and let's see what this looks like. Turn this right side out. And here's my cuff. There's the gathering. It looks pretty even. You can hardly even tell it's gathered. That's what the gathering does, so instead of it being all on one side. Double check the fit. It slides over my hand just fine. Pretty cute. So I hope you enjoyed this entire sew along, including the pattern hacks, and I look forward to seeing what you're sewing.
So what do you think? What a fun sleeve. If you made that a little bit longer, it could be a dress or wear it over leggings, since that's all I'm wearing these days. So I hope you enjoyed this Linda Tunic marathon sew along, and I can't wait to see what you're working on. So if you want to watch this again, be sure to follow my Facebook page or subscribe to my YouTube channel wherever you're watching this, and leave your questions. I always go back and check those. Until then, I'll see you next week.